Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you can hear me. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, joined by my colleague Claudia Williams. Together, we produce our Sensemaker email every morning. And we're joined in spirit by Santander, one of our founding partners who support Sensemaker Live every week. And we're very grateful for that. I like to think of this event, Sensemaker Live, as a bit like the Large Hadron Collider underneath Geneva. This is the Large News Collider. It's where slow news and old news or conventional news come together on a Friday lunchtime, and we try to make sense of it. So for those of you who have never read our Sensemaker email, it's what we put out to try and ensure that our members have a way of keeping up with breaking news, even though that's precisely what Tortoise, as a rule, tries to steer past to see what's behind the news. And this is a think-in, and think-ins are a big part of that process. I will briefly rehearse what they are for those of you who may not have been to a in the flesh or digital think-in before. The model is a newspaper leader conference or editorial conference. The purpose is for us all to listen, disagree cordially, express our points of view, and emerge from it, with any luck, with a more informed one. It lasts an hour. We do use the Zoom recording function, and my main job is to try and ensure that as many people as possible are heard. We have a loosely enforced no questions rule, but please, that doesn't mean don't speak up. It means speak up. Say what's on your mind. And if it has to be a question, and frankly, with this subject about which I don't know enough, it might very well be a question if you're anything like me. Then ask it and I'll probably allow it. Because at Sensemaker, we try to keep track of the news. The first thing I think we have to do today is acknowledge that for the past 11 days now, America has been searching its soul and getting to its feet, and then in many cases sitting down again and singing at largely peaceful protests. Although, of course, we've all seen endless images of the occasions on which at the front line they've turned violent. Of a big country trying to come to terms with a terrible crime. And then these protests have spread around the world. And they're against a deep-seated and often unacknowledged racism that we are all being forced, not before time, to confront. Now, this week, we've already hosted 2 think-ins specifically on the lived Black experience of racism in the States, worldwide, of processing the implications of the murder of George Floyd. And that discussion will continue, and I'm sure that today's discussion will get there as well. But I wanted at least to start by shifting the focus and making it broader. And as we've advertised, we'll try and make this about protest and big tech. And Claudia and I were thinking about this beforehand. And it seems that there are 3 parts to this discussion, which I'd like to get to. There is protest within the big tech companies, on which we've reported in some depth, and will continue to do so, calling them the tech nations, treating them as nations. There's protest enabled by the platforms that they support, that are their product, and there's protest by big tech, and that's rather more specific, and that's where I wanted to start in just a second. But first, I want to make sure that everybody understands the chat function. At the bottom of your screens, you can click on the chat button, and if you haven't already, you will see that Claudia is there, ready to harvest all your comments. And you may find that we come to you if they're particularly fascinating. To the left of the chat tab at the bottom of the screen is a participants button. Click on that. You'll get a full list of everybody in the room. And as you know, at the bottom right-hand corner of that list is a raise hand button. So to show that you're paying attention, can you please click on that button if in the past 11 days you have used social media to proactively join or protest yourself? Do you feel you have used social media to protest? Let's try and make a, that's interesting. That's about a quarter of us, I think. Let's try and make a fine distinction between proactive protest and endorsing somebody else's. Of course, there are many ways of doing that on social media. Is there a larger number who feel that they've done that? Right. I'm actually surprised that there aren't more blue hands up there, given how many people I have heard wishing that, but for coronavirus, they could have attended protests near where they live. Perhaps that's because I live in London and there was a big one here, but may not be the case everywhere else. But as I said, I wanted to start specifically. And we're joined by Gian Volpicelli, who is Tech and Politics editor at Wired UK, and has written, hi Gian, has written very interestingly about the origins of Twitter's dispute with President Trump, which was boiling over roughly at the moment that the protest started with the murder of George Floyd, but on a separate issue. Gian, I wanted to come to the big question of what's really at stake in this standoff between Twitter and Trump. But if you could, to start with, can you explain for those of us for whom this is pretty new, the whole business of Section 230, what it means and how it came about?
So Section 230 is often dubbed the 26 words that made the modern internet. It's this this specific rule in the 1996 Communications Decency Act. And essentially what it did, even if it's often misunderstood, it removed liability. It essentially removed the liability for third-party content from websites. So which means that internet platforms became were no longer legally liable for content they hosted but was produced by third-party individuals, by third parties. So if somebody, for instance, posted something illegal or offensive on a website or even on a comment section, the Section 230 meant that they weren't liable anymore. But actually, this is a sort of a bastardized, a sort of wrong way of looking at it, because actually, the First Amendment rule itself, like First Amendment, already made sure that a company, their website, could just host any kind of content without being liable legally. The problem was that as soon as a platform, a website, decided to moderate that content, it became, it started to be regarded as a publisher. It started to be regarded as someone that was making an editorial decision and therefore became liable. So Section 230 changed that by adding a clause saying that even if the platform took some action within certain limits to moderate content, it still was not liable for third-party posts or content. So essentially, the Section 230, what it did was it created the freedom to moderate. It allowed websites to moderate, strangely enough. And the reason why...
Can I just interrupt? I want to go back to be clear about the position of the First Amendment in all this, because it's such a fundamental part of the American way of life. Are you saying that was in effect the default position?
That was the default position. A company could just decide not to moderate anything,
Yeah.
And it could just claim for the First Amendment defense, apart from a few cases, obviously, I suppose. Like,
But initially, in the early days of the internet, could a company also moderate content and claim protection under the First Amendment? Or did it immediately become
from what I
complicated
understood,
and legal?
the difference there, the distinction there, which is the distinction we today call platform versus publisher, right? But back then was distributor versus publisher. So a company could just decide to raise their hands and say, I'm not going to touch anything. I'm just a distributor. I'm just like a newsstand. And so I'm not liable for the newspapers. I realize it's sort of watertight metaphor. The newspapers I'm exposing here, if they contain any illegal or libelous article, as opposed to a publisher. Because if a publisher publishes something that is illegal or libelous, they're going to be liable for that. So no, as soon as a platform, and that's of course it's contentious, there are several interpretations, it's always dependent on various court cases, but the default position seemed to be that as soon as a platform took the stance and decided to enforce certain editing or publishing standards, censor guidelines, it sort of relinquished its distributor status and became a publisher and therefore was liable. And that's where 230 came in, and it said, even if you enforce a certain degree of moderation, of content moderation, you are still not a publisher. You are still what we call today a platform.
Great. Okay, thanks. When approximately did 230 come in, and did the big tech firms lobby heavily for it? Was it a long and expensive litigation process?
No, it came in 1996, and it did come out, from what I remember, it did come out from any of the current players lobbying, because 1996, I don't think that Facebook was around, for instance. I don't remember if Google was already around, but if it was, it wasn't really grappling too much with content moderation on YouTube. I don't think YouTube even existed back then. No, it came out of like, there was a sort of a strange dichotomy there. There were two very similar websites whose names I don't remember. I'm not going to try to remember, but they were very similar. They were essentially sort of internet forums, and one was a sort of 4chan like free-for-all forum where anybody could publish anything, even if the things were libelous. And when it got sued, it got away because it was a distributor. And when another similar website actually removed some content, it was also sued, it was considered a publisher. And so for whatever it was that it was sued about, it actually got a conviction. But it didn't arise out of the current players lobbying. I'm sure there might have been some sort of past players lobbying, but Facebook didn't bring about Section 230, certainly.
No.
Because it wasn't there. I think that Mark Zuckerberg was probably in his teens.
Right, yes. All those
he
years
was
ago.
born in 1984.
Jan, I'm going to give you a chance later to come back and address all the big issues with the household names in. But first, I want to turn, if I can, to Jasper Jackson, who is media columnist at the New Statesman, but also, as you just explained, special projects editor at First Draft News, and spending a lot of time looking at the use of misinformation on social media right now. But Jasper, you wrote a piece for The Independent this week in which you asked a really interesting question about the Twitter-Trump standoff, which is why now? Can you just go back over for us what the argument is about and see if you can answer that question, why now?
So, I mean, what happened recently was that Donald Trump tweeted one of his many factually inaccurate statements. The first one was specifically, or first two tweets were specifically about mail-in voting, which unsurprisingly is being considered as an option for various votes in the US at the moment because of the coronavirus outbreak. And Trump basically alleged this would lead to widespread ballot fraud. Various tweets have suggested that people were being mailed their ballots rather than applications for mail-in voting. And the tweets were basically fell foul of Twitter's specific rules about misinformation around elections, because they've identified this as a big problem. The thing is, though, that Donald Trump has been tweeting misinformation and outright lies for quite a long period of time. So what was interesting is that they actually decided to apply fact-checking flags. These flags basically provided additional context. They linked through to Twitter Moments, which is one of Twitter's formats, where they collect various bits of information and tweets. And it had lots of context, sort of fact checks of the actual statements, etc. And they did this on 2 tweets by Trump. And Trump responded by threatening to re-examine Section 230 through an executive order, which probably isn't legal. He probably can't do very much about it via executive order. He'd probably need the legislature, the Senate and the House, to do something about that. But he threatened this. And then, we thought, people who spend far too much time thinking about this stuff thought, wow, that's a big deal. Twitter has finally actually decided to take on Donald Trump. And then I think it was just the next day, Trump tweeted a statement in which he included the phrase, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, which, whether he knew it or not, is a direct quote from a former Miami police chief who was accused of widespread brutality in black neighborhoods in Miami. And among other sort of very inflammatory statements. And then Twitter imposed another flag. This time, the flag basically said that it violated Twitter's rules on glorifying violence. And it hid the tweet. It stopped people from liking it or retweeting it unless they were commenting around it. And that was, a further escalation of Twitter actually taking on Trump.
Why do you, Jasper? Why do you think it has taken 4 years because as you pointed out with the chronology, the ballot fraud allegations or the alleged risks of mail-in voting preceded the looting shooting tweet. But as you point out, Trump has been essentially lying on Twitter for a very long time. Why did it take so long for Jack Dorsey, the Trump chief exec, the Twitter CEO, forgive me, to summon the courage to do this? Does anybody know?
So I'm most of what I'm going to say is based upon speculation around the context we find ourselves in. I can't read Dorsey or his senior team's mind. What I'd say, the context is Twitter used to describe itself, I believe, as the free speech wing of the free speech party. And they've, like very large other chunks of the tech industry, they have always, whether genuinely or through reasons for self-interest, have always pushed the idea that they believe absolutely in free speech, that in the same way, the US has the First Amendment, which is a very strong protection of free speech. And they've often used this to defend not dealing with content on their platforms that is either false or hateful, abusive, harassment, etc. There's been a long process of sort of climbing back from that absolutist stance, due largely to pressure from the public and the threat of regulation from governments, particularly the European Union, which has been far stronger on the potential for regulation in various areas around the tech industry for years. Why they chose to do it now? I mean, it's been this long process. I personally think that the coronavirus outbreak has actually had an impact here because all the tech platforms have become much more aggressive at dealing with false information on their platforms during the pandemic.
Right.
And I think that's for 2 reasons, as I've said, is that one, it's just quite clear that the potential for actual harm to life, wide-scale damage from the promotion of dodgy treatments, from vaccine hesitancy, etc., that misinformation can cause during this pandemic is heightened massively. It's just not doing something was no longer an option in the same way when it was, a few people being harassed or as has happened, lynchings in various countries, India, hatred of the Rohingya in Burma. During this pandemic, it just didn't seem like an option not to intervene. Also, during the pandemic, it seems easier to identify misinformation. You know, politics is difficult. It's you know, always up for debate about what's a lie, what's not a lie. Is it interpretation? Whereas I think a lot of the tech platforms thought that a pandemic would offer much more clear-cut cases of misinformation, disinformation to deal with. That hasn't been the case, but they found themselves already intervening far more than they have done previously. Now, in that situation, you can see that it is a shorter step to finally dealing with a man who has spent a large amount of time spreading huge amounts of disinformation. The number of people tracking how many times he lies a day, let alone a week, a year, is huge. And I think they were already closer. Having said that, if you compare the response of Facebook to this, you know, Mark Zuckerberg went on Fox News and said that we shouldn't be the arbiters of truth. This is despite the fact that his company has been fact-checking stuff, taking stuff down for years. The difference is that Twitter has actually decided that it's going to take on Trump, and Facebook hasn't so far. Now, that to me suggests that those overall factors have been affecting it, but it does look like Dorsey has taken somewhat of a moral stance to some extent to actually address this. And you know, the response of Twitter changing its logo to you know, blacking out its logo in support of the protests in solidarity and you know, the protests against George Floyd's death, it may be virtue signaling, but at the same time, it does suggest that they are trying to make it clear they are taking a moral perspective on this. Right. And frankly, taking on Trump doesn't seem like a particularly great business decision for most social media companies.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested to hear actually what people think about that gesture by Twitter, whether it is virtue signaling or substantive in any way. I noticed Professor Lucy Huberman has added to the chat a guide to section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Lucy, I wondered if you have a view on whether Trump legally has any chance of changing the law here, because I noted that another person who supports revisiting the act is none other than Joe Biden. But anyway, I'd be interested to hear your view.
I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I bet you've got a lawyer on here who could give you a better answer. I wanted to say something else, which is how these companies signal, intention and what they're doing. I mean, Facebook announced its new stellar, editorial oversight advisory board during this time, which I think is supposed to reassure people that, terrible things that happen on its platform will be dealt with. There's a lot of skepticism about that. So I'm sorry, it's a different point, but it's about the different ways the different platforms may be trying to grope towards some responsibility. I can't really talk about the legal thing, but I think if Biden's talking about it, then there are enough legislators in the US watching this to help give us a view. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. You have been very effective in putting out an appeal for lawyers to come forward and tell us. I mean, as I understand it, Biden wanted the whole question revisited in order to oblige the platforms to be more proactive against foreign and specifically Russian disinformation that could affect electoral outcomes. But while we're on those kind of signals that you mentioned, does the Facebook announcement of its new advisory board give you any more faith in its ability to be the kind of platform that you want it to be?
I mean, I read Alan Rusbridge's article with a lot of sort of hope. He felt he had to explain at great length why he was prepared to join this board. And I sort of trust in his good faith. The board looks a bit like the United Nations. So I don't yet know how cases are going to be, are they going to be raised with the board? Are they just going to look at things quarterly, annually? I'm not sure if anyone else here maybe might, I don't know if other people know anything about how it's actually going to operate. The only coverage I've seen so far is really about its composition and Facebook being able to say, look, we've done this.
you mentioned Mike. I don't know if you're referring to Mike Butcher, but I would like to come.
am.
Yes, I would like to come to Mike Butcher, editor of TechCrunch UK. I hope I've got your job title right. You're making the point in chat that Twitter makes far too much money out of Trump. I wonder why then that they would make any move to shut him down. But Mike, I also wanted to move on with you to the Zuckerberg question. But tell us first what you whether you think Twitter is taking a commercial hit by doing this.
No, I don't think Twitter's taking a commercial hit. It's actually in the business now of protecting its advertisers. It no longer wants the liability that Trump is forcing upon the platform. Should protesters be shot and killed as a result of President Trump's tweets, Twitter could quite easily be open to class action in the US. Twitter has banned political advertising from its platform precisely because it no longer wants the liability of being tarnished with, say, electing populists like Trump, etc. It just doesn't want to be in that business, and that's why it's also advantageously taking advantage of Zuckerberg and Facebook's stance, where Zuckerberg and Facebook will take those ad dollars. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so the two are facing off at each other. Obviously, Twitter sounds like it's taking a moral high ground, but it's got a double whammy. It sounds like it's taking a moral high ground, but it is also signaling to advertisers that their platform is safer than Zuckerberg's and less of a platform open to action.
Do you think Zuckerberg is going to regret the stance that he's taken so far?
Sorry. Well, I think he's certainly lit the fire under some of his employees who are pretty fed up with the situation. Is he going to take a hit? He's doing a very delicate balancing act because he does not want regulation. He doesn't want to be WhatsApp or Instagram and Facebook to be broken up out of, or Messenger to be broken out of the Facebook entity, just in the same way that the US government broke up the Bell companies, famously the baby bells, and basically broke up big oil in the before the Second World War, and then later on broke up big telecom in the 60s and 70s, and allowed many telecom communications companies to fly. He wants to keep everything under the one umbrella, and so he has to play this frankly delicate balancing act by keeping Trump happy on one side, saying that they're a platform for conservatives, it's all good, and at the other side, basically fighting a fire with his own employees who are absolutely fed up to the back teeth with the sheer amount of disinformation on Facebook.
The walkout, have people actually quit?
Yes, people are quitting. You can see it on Twitter. It's not significant. Well, when I say significant, it's not senior executives quitting at this point. A couple of days ago, a whole engineering team called the React engineering team, which is quite crucial to Facebook's platform, all signed a joint statement saying that about Black Lives Matter and protesting the amount of disinformation on the platform, and that there wasn't nearly enough support for the Black Lives Matter movement, and obviously also Zuckerberg's sort of dilly-dallying over and vagueness over his statements. So there is clear, rebellion inside the ranks.
Right, thank you. Claudia, because there's so much on the chat, I'm not managing to keep up, so I'm trusting you to let me know when we need to switch and pay attention there. But I do see Yasmin asking about self-regulation, and I'd be interested to know what you'd like as an alternative. Yasmin, are you there? Can we come to you? And then Claudia,
okay,
whatever I've missed.
I was unprepared.
I'm sorry. It's an occupational hazard of typing interesting things in the chat.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, I mean, this is something that is not a foreign conversation to anyone who has sort of spent time thinking about how online spaces, social media, etc. should work. And I think self-regulation is an interesting one. It's obviously the solution that tech companies prefer because it's within their control, right? And as I mentioned in the chat, I used to work in oil and gas love self-regulation because you can control the image that you put out, you can deal with things internally, but generally, whether it's the police, whether it's the military, whether it's oil and gas, self-regulation tends not to work, or certainly it works best for the people who are regulating rather than, for the stakeholders like, say, ourselves as users or the society. And there's an argument to be made that actually the way that platforms operate is more of a public utility. And so perhaps we should be regulating them as a public utility rather than as private companies. But that's a much different conversation. That's a conversation around what do we want these platforms to actually be doing in our society. At the moment, they're just private companies, but they don't really operate. I mean, even Tortoise, you're looking at them as nations. So how can we be considering them private company? How can they still be operating as private companies when their power is so different to that?
Mm. Well, that's a Tortoise assertion. But yes, speaking of which, if Alexei is in the room, I would like to come to you, Alexei Mostrous, briefly, my fellow editor, because you've written a lot of this week's magnum opus on Amazon.
Yes.
And you were hinting in an email before we started that you felt that Big Jeff hadn't handled this as well as he might, or as well as some of his counterparts. Do I have that right?
No, I think that's right. I think what's interesting about each company's response to what's happening in America is that it kind of sums up what that particular company is all about. It says something quite kind of particular about that company's individual ethos. So Amazon comes from a position where, unlike someone like Apple, for instance, it doesn't really have that clear or defined a social purpose outside of its central mission, which is to please the customer. It's famously customer obsessed, and that narrow focus has been maintained even as it's grown to a 1.2 trillion pound company. So that causes friction when something like this happens. What you saw was Bezos put something out on Instagram. It was an essay that he urged his managers to read about black pain, and there was also a kind of generalized statement on Twitter from Amazon supporting solidarity with the black community, and that really caused two quite justifiable kickbacks against Amazon. The first was from people saying, "Hang on a minute, you sell facial recognition software to police forces across the US." And this facial recognition software has been proven by researchers at MIT and at other institutions to be biased against ethnic minorities. And yet you sell it, and you sell it with a kind of caveat that these results might not be completely accurate. But Amazon don't measure whether that caveat is applied. They don't measure how many police forces have even bought. They don't even know how many police forces are using recognition. And that's because their entire focus is not on the wider social context around facial recognition. It's around selling more of this software. And equally, when they made these two posts, you also got quite a lot of reaction from people like Christian Smalls, who we spoke to for our investigation. He was a guy working at Staten Island, a warehouse run by Amazon, and he got fired, he says, for raising safety concerns about COVID-19, and he pointed out, hold on a minute, you're expressing solidarity for black people, and yet in the 48 vice presidents that you have at the company, there is no black person in that group. You know, I think Amazon employees are made up of about 26% Black people across the board. But in the leadership category, Amazon hasn't really done anything to promote them into positions of leadership. And in fact, in 2016, they actually rejected a shareholder plea to put in place active measures to promote an ethnically diverse leadership structure. So with Amazon, at least, what you've seen is a real divide between what their social media PR team tells them to put out and what is actually going on in the company.
Yeah, well, thank you for highlighting it. And I don't envy you the repertorial task of getting past their press firewall, as it were. While you were speaking, Yasmin came back on the chat to advocate different types of regulation. I'd be interested to know what you have in mind, but also Gian, let me just come to you. And I'm sorry, Claudia, I keep saying I'm going to come to you, but Gian, I want you to explain what you mean. Left field opinion, Zuckerberg actually craves regulation. What sort of regulation are we talking about?
Well, I think that there are advantages, first of all, in having written rules to find the loopholes in, as opposed to be just vilified constantly on moral grounds. So it would be much easier for Zuckerberg just to say, well, I'm sticking to the rules, to the law. But also there is a case to be made, and some experts, some lawyers I interviewed for the piece on the Section 230 pointed out that if Trump or Biden were to replace or change or repeal Section 230, for instance, and essentially changing the way platforms operate right now, requiring either a much stronger moderation regime or a no moderation regime at all, absence of moderation, Zuckerberg and Facebook would be well positioned to enforce very effective moderation policies, because they have the numbers, they have the money, they have the expertise. And a lot of smaller competitors, of which there aren't many already, but there will be even fewer in the future, wouldn't be that well positioned to do that. And so they will essentially be mowed down by this new stringent or regulation. So essentially, regulation has always been something Zuckerberg has been asking very vocally about. And I actually think he means it. I don't think it's something he just says for show. I think he actually wants some rules to find loopholes in and to weaponize against his rivals.
That's very interesting. Do we know if he's specifically lobbying in that direction in Washington?
I don't know about Washington. I'm sure that there have been several moves in that sense in Brussels, which is also has been pretty vocal. Funnily enough, the one commissioner was very vocal about fake news was Julian King, the last British commissioner.
Ah. Of course, we don't have one
Not anymore.
But that's for another thinking. Claudia, busy in the chat. What are we missing?
It is busy in the chat. There's one, if Kaz is around, I'd love to come to her at some point, because a little bit ago she did make a really interesting point about Twitter's strategic play in this context. So maximizing Twitter's commercial benefit with Trump, saying that he essentially catapulted Twitter onto the map. And now that he's potentially going to be out of office, they're, in her opinion, pivoting into their next sustainable revenue growth by taking him on. And that is a fascinating play, which I think is a really interesting point. And I think Alice is making a really good point in the chat as well about what kind of regulation we're talking about in regards to protest. I think we can probably come to her after me. And I think Mike has also brought up a great question, which we can all talk about, which is how is tech being used at the moment in these specific protests and in protests around the world to get ahead of authorities, get ahead of the police? I think that's a really interesting way that this conversation can go.
Thank you. Well, let's go to Alice if we can, for your views on future regulation. Is that right?
I can talk about future regulation if you like. I think in general, this conversation needs to be around what's happening right now with regards to protests and big tech in particular. And obviously we're in a period where a lot of people are waking up to what Black Lives Matter actually means. And I think it is our responsibility to think about theories of anti-racism and otherness in public spaces, so that we actually then have a concrete idea about how to regulate. So basically right now we're kind of in a situation where our democratic theory is based on quite colonialist ideas, particularly ideas around deliberation, which effectively comes from 1950s philosophy. And we really need to wake up to what philosophers of today are saying about this, what philosophers of today are saying about the role and the power of anger in protest, and how we can kind of make sure that there are different voices on social media that don't get silenced, whilst also thinking about the incriminations of like how hate speech is just, you know, how are we still at this point, you know, where we're not really thinking beyond what we were talking about in the 90s, I suppose. Why are we still talking about the number of Black people on boards when that is just like a little indication? It's like a persuasive metric that people have been using to talk about the fact that racism exists, rather than the heart of the issue, which is that our institutions are based on quite colonialist and racist principles. And we need to address that before we can then start addressing any of these issues around content moderation in tech companies, and how tech companies, you know, affect justice, and whether or not there is any justice with tech companies because they've got too much power, and the surveillance and the privacy and the enforcement of these laws. We really need to get back to basics here. And that's when people are talking about educate yourself. It's about a culture change, because yeah, we need to change our culture and not just focus on these little niche ideas around content moderation, really.
That's a great point, but it does prompt the question, how? So what is the forum, what is the mechanism to do that crucial first stage of the process that you outline?
Well, I mean,
is it school?
I mean, I think adults should be going back to school, right? It's not just about what kids are doing between the ages of 4 and 21. It's about how adults have access to information as well. So Tortoise is a great example of this, pioneering new ways of doing thinkings. But I mean, I might then just start promoting what I do. I teach ethics to technologists. I teach theories of power and oppression, and people can choose to do that or not to choose that. It's not just about education as being an institution, it's education as being a mindset and a culture change. And these things take generations, but it's up to us as people, you know, like there's a number of people I can see on this call who are part of the media elite, and just, you know, it's such a awful, like, it's such a cliche, but changing the narrative goes beyond these statistics. We're not trying to persuade people that racism exists anymore. What we're trying to do is say, okay, well, what next? What is going to be this next narrative that we're going to hold on to? And for me, talking about percentage of Black people and women in boards, just we need to get beyond this conversation, quite frankly, and we need to find new little sound bites in order to do that.
Okay, well, you had me at I teach ethics to technologists. I'm afraid we can't let that lie.
Oh. I'm trying.
What exactly do you teach? And is that a category that is in a special need of ethics teaching, or do we all need it?
I mean, I think my personal thing is, how do we get philosophy into the workplace? And that is a tiny part of the puzzle right now when it comes to protest and when it comes to all these various different issues that we have. But I think as an individual, you take a micro issue and then you try and you're an activist for that, right? And so I teach ethics technologists. So, you know, ethics of AI and algorithms fundamentally looks at theories of power, theories of oppression. It's not just bias here, it's about where do we think that power structures should exist. But I don't want to, you know, I don't think that this is a forum for self-promotion, really. I'm merely inviting you to say what you're doing, because it seems to me that you do one of the crucial things that you said earlier needs to be done. Though, of course, the point that we need to educate ourselves is a good one and well taken. We can't just hope that an ethics teacher walks into our lives. I want to switch, before we run out of time, to the role that Twitter in particular, but other platforms as well, have played as an enabler of, excuse me, I have to switch off my phone, as an enabler of the kinds of global
movement that has taken fire, caught fire over the past 2 weeks, if that's not too news focused a way to look at it all. I mean, Claudia, are you free to read or paraphrase what Abiola was saying that we were talking about earlier? No. Okay, but I'm gonna. Oh, she's looking for it.
Can you come back to me, Giles, and I will.
Yeah.
1 second.
So the point here, if I can crudely paraphrase it, is a lot of white people simply don't understand how important Twitter and other platforms have been to disseminating messages, images, ideas among the Black community and frankly the whole concerned community over the past 2 weeks and over time, because it is a new media platform that has not previously been colonized by a white dominated elite. Is that a fair? I'd be really interested to know if anybody agrees that there's a rather special role that these platforms have played in that regard, and whether they deserve some protection because of it. The narrative so far has been that these platforms are all out of control, ruling our lives, and need regulation rather than protection. But I'd be really interested to know what people make of that. But first of all, can I come back to Jasper? And I'd like to ask you before we run out of time. There are, and Alexei put up very interestingly, a list of 190 tech firms that have put out statements in relation to George Floyd's murder. What do you think? I can't claim to have read any but a small handful of them, but Tim Cook's letter to his company was perhaps the standout one in terms of its profile and the tone, as if written by a presidential speechwriter. In broad terms, do you think all these statements are put out of a sense of obligation and virtue signaling, or do they reflect something genuine that's happening in the tech industry?
I mean, I think to give the annoying answer, it's a combination of the two. Tech companies tend to have, well, let's put this, younger customers broadly, very broadly. New customers are young. The dangers to their existing business models tend to come from youth adoption habits. You also have staff who, there are certainly some, you've seen with Google has issues with sort of very right-wing reactionary people within the organization, but by and large they tend to be slightly liberal-leaning, slightly more left-wing, more tolerant. They tend to live in cities, so you have a combination of both their customer base and their staff tend to be slightly in favor of a lot of these movements. So there's a commercial benefit to it from ensuring you don't piss off your customers. And there is also the fact that if your staff as an organization generally lean that way, then there is, you're expressing your company's beliefs. I think the important thing to remember about pretty much every company though, is that, they are legally required pretty much above all else to pursue shareholder value. There are restraints, etc., and various different bits of regulation, but by and large, their goal is shareholder value. So while they may be, Tim Cook quite likely does have a significant amount of support for civil rights movements. He's one of the only gay CEOs of our most valuable companies. But at the same time, it's only with commercial imperatives, which come with the fear of losing users, the fear of not picking up the next generation that will actually persuade them to take moral stances like this. But I mean, to my mind, I don't really care why they're doing it. If it's outside pressure or inside pressure, taking moral stances on, you know, issues that, where there is, in this case, quite clearly a right and wrong, I think is probably a good thing for those companies to do.
Right. Thank you. I see Naomi S. concurring in the chat with what Alice was saying earlier, and also saying we need to move on from how can we do this to resources are out there, educate yourself. Now, Jasper's talking about sort of corporate response to this. Naomi, I'd be interested to know, in terms of our broader response, have you seen, I'm getting a bit of feedback, but have you seen over the past 10, 11 days a new energy behind the whole goal of self-education, or are we still flailing around too much and asking other people to help us out?
Well, yes, I think we are asking people to take on the emotional labor of explaining to us what the problem is, rather than just taking time to read some of the books. I mean, I've been really inspired or impressed, I think, by Renietta Lodge and the response that she put on Twitter, which is that she's not taking media calls at the moment. Nothing that she said has really changed in the last 10 years. And then links to other resources. She took the opportunity to amplify other people. And I think, you know, the resources are out there. And I think we as white people need to understand when sometimes we're just being lazy and asking somebody to explain it to us one more time when the information is out there if we want it. And the answer is there if we want it. So the real question is, if it's too hard for us to pick up a book, are we really ready to do the work? And I think the work needs doing.
But have you seen a new willingness to pick up the book?
Possibly. But what I've also seen is just a greater level of exhaustion from Black friends, that they're being asked to do more of the work. They're being asked to do more of the work, and they're tired. Mm. And if we're being friendly, if we really want to reach out to people that we care about, then we need. I'm doing this now, so that somebody else doesn't have to. You know, it's not. I'm less emotionally infected or affected by what's going on because I'm not Black. So I'm thinking for friends who are, I'll say it and save them the energy right now, so they've got their energy to do something else. But it felt like it has sounded like a reflexive question. Oh, great, you know, that sounds like a really good idea. Yes, how do I start? And it's like, well, you know how to start. Read and ask yourself, why do you not know where to begin? I think we've all been in rooms, we've all been in meetings where people have said something that was racist, or where people have let something slide, and we felt that at that moment it was too, you know, it was socially uncomfortable or awkward to say something, and now we've got to say something. What we're seeing is the result of lots of opportunities where things weren't picked up and things weren't said, and it becomes cumulative, and here we are. Well, that's on us as white people, it's on us. We're responsible. And it's not for somebody else to explain it to us, because we understand it better. I was talking to a friend last night, and it occurred to me that she's Black, so she's not in the rooms that I'm in, where it's just white people talking. And in fact, it's at those times when I'm in a room where it's just white people talking, those are the times that I've got to say something.
Naomi, we started with a why now question, which I posed to Jasper about the specific issue of why Twitter has now chosen this particular sort of month to take on Trump. But there's a why now question about what we're talking about now. One of the awful things about George Floyd's murder was it's not an isolated event. It's the latest of dozens. Do you have an explanation of the answer to that why now question?
Okay, so 20 odd years ago, I was training to be a social worker, and I did my dissertation on unaccompanied asylum seekers' rights to social care. And one of the things that I was studying in that was the McPherson report. And one of the things related to that was a study of people who work in the immigration system, and that was 20 years ago. And the finding was that people arrived in there with an intention to do good. They wanted to work in the immigration system.
Naomi, I'm losing the audio.
Better?
That's great,
Yeah.
Thank you.
So people would start work with the intention of doing the right thing for refugees and working well in the immigration system, but they would come into a culture that was intrinsically racist, and as a result of ironically working at Luna House, working in the immigration system, they would become more racist. So there's something about culture, and I think one of the things I found really interesting this week is that I hadn't realised that the unions, the police unions, and the culture of the policing in America is itself so racist, but actually reflecting on that and considering what I already knew and had studied about the English immigration system and our hostile environment makes me think that actually it's so, I think one of your speakers earlier said, this is a hangover of colonialism, absolutely, but it's absolutely in our system, it's ingrained. And even if you go into the system to try and change the system, the culture will get you. And that I find very difficult.
Sure, but sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just very hard.
Yes, but
insofar as there's a sense that the thing of educating yourself and so on is also about. Pardon?
It's almost as if we're separated by many time zones, and I don't think we are. But so social media has let us down a little bit over this thing. No, I was just what you say about the culture at Luna House is fascinating, but it leaves unanswered the why now question about what's happening now.
Because nothing stopped.
Okay.
Nothing stopped. That why now? Why always? What we're seeing now is continuous. It's been this way since forever. Why not now? It might feel more inconveniently apparent at the moment, but it's always just under the surface. This is the exhausting point for people who are Black. The people that we work with are continuously, this is it. Look at the prison stats, look at the new Jim Crow, look at the fact that despite the high number of Black people who have been killed in police custody in this country, no police officer has ever been successfully prosecuted. That's continuous. It's continuous. So when this comes up, it feels acute because a man was killed and a film was made, and that's new. Mm-hmm. But the reality that this is something that's continuously happening, that people are continuously frightened that this could happen to them when they're out on the street, the fact that people are just tweeting and Facebooking this week. I didn't realize that Charles de Menezes, sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, I didn't realize that he hadn't jumped the gates. It's acute, it's continuous. That our own government used the George Floyd murder as an opportunity to delay publishing the PHE report on BAME deaths in our own country. So cynical, so subtle, so British, so polite. so clever, so typical. Nothing changes. If we want this to change, it's on us as white people. It's on us to take on national labour and deal with it.
I've got to interrupt. I'm sorry, just because we've reached 2 o'clock, and I need to wrap things up. But thank you very much for your contribution, which I think did bring us forcibly back to where we all have been in a sense recently. But you make the point that it's continuous, and we should have been there 20 years ago, if not more. Lane in the chat is making the interesting point. It would have been great to have a techie protester on the panel here today. Do we have anyone who considers themselves a techie protester in the room? Lane, maybe that includes you. What is a techie protester? Can we go to Lane? Normally we have first names as well as last names, but if not, not to worry. I'm going, before closing, to give Gian and Jasper just a quick opportunity to wrap up. Gian, first of all. What do you think that on balance, just coming back to the point about cultures that Naomi made and Alice before, do you think in the tech nations there is now a positive culture with regard to race, or is there a cultural problem?
Wow. Well, I mean, I think that as Jasper underlined, until you change the color, in a way, the color composition of the boardroom, we can't really call the process to be completed at all. And if you just look at Facebook's or Google's boardroom, it's clear that the diversity is still, I mean, a far cry from being achieved. Sorry, I activated my Alexa accidentally. I think it's changed. Something is changing. I just don't know whether this change is simply something that has been triggered by the impending election, and that come 2021, everything will go back to what it used to be, in a way. I mean, because don't forget that the whole process, the whole controversy between Trump and Twitter hasn't really been triggered by the George Floyd death, but by something about voter suppression. And that was the thing. And maybe it's just something that was brewing there within Twitter about the election. Facebook isn't really doing much apart from having these virtual walkouts with whose effectiveness we can't gauge yet. As for Amazon and Apple, I mean, I don't think that just a statement, a couple of statements will change much until the diversity within the boardrooms change.
Okay, I've got to cut you off there because we are over time. But Jasper, I've got a very quick, specific question for you. Do you think that we have seen peak Trump on Twitter?
No. I mean, while he's on it, he'll keep using it to broadcast to as many people as he can. And, you know, he one thing we know about Trump is that he loves attention. So he'll keep using it and people will keep responding to it. It'll be interesting to see what Twitter does next when he next breaches their rules.
Thank you both very much, and thanks everyone. It's been a wide-ranging conversation. I appreciate that the question of how we all need to be responding to the deep personal issues raised by the murder of George Floyd, or that were there all along, are somewhat separate from the question of corporate culture in tech firms, but there is an intersection, there is an overlap, and it affects us all the time, every day, because we spend so much time on these platforms, so much time communicating with each other. And I hope that doing a bit more of that today has been of benefit. I would just like to pick out 2 points, really. One is Alice's, that actually metrics like diversity on boards are pretty meaningless without the wholesale cultural change that has to precede it. And secondly, the notion that if regulation is required to control in some way the discourse on the Tech Nations platforms and help us all in the fight against misinformation and disinformation, then we need to make sure that we do that from a starting point that isn't tokenistic, that starts with that cultural change. I won't go on because we're already 5 minutes over, but thank you, Jasper, Gian, Naomi, Alice, many others, and Claudia. And join us all for another Sensemaker Live next week. In the meantime, in this extraordinarily unseasonable cold, stay warm. The sun has come out where I am, and have a great weekend. We can wave to each other, so let's do that. Thank you very much.